The radio crackled in the early hours before dawn, a thin voice fighting static like a man clawing for air. Private Eddie Novak leaned closer, the glow from the dials painting his knuckles a sickly green. Somewhere beyond the barracks walls, the English countryside slept under low clouds, damp and indifferent. Poland fell in weeks, the announcer said. France in 44 days. The German advance continues to shock the world. Eddie shut the radio off. Outside, boots thudded on packed dirt as men moved through the cold, carrying rifles, coffee cups, letters folded and unfolded until the creases went soft. It was 1941, and America was still pretending distance meant safety. But everyone in that camp knew the truth. Hitler's armies were moving like wildfire across Europe, and the smoke was already drifting across the Atlantic. Captain Thomas Hale stood near the edge of the parade ground, staring at a map tacked to a board. He'd been up all night, cigarette burning down between his fingers until it singed his skin. He didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on red arrows slashing across countries: Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, France. Each arrow felt personal, like a finger pressed into his chest. They didn't just take land, he muttered to no one. They broke the old rules. Lieutenant Sam Carter approached, helmet under his arm. He was younger than Hale, still carried some college boy softness in his face. But the war had already started carving lines into him. Men are asking questions, Carter said, about why we're training so hard if we're not even in the fight. Hale finally looked up. Because by the time we are, he said, it won't be a fight. It'll be a storm. Across the ocean, the storm had already hit. In a small Brooklyn apartment, Anna Novak pressed her ear to the radio as if closeness might make the words kinder. She pictured her younger brother Eddie standing somewhere foreign, holding a rifle he'd never fired at a man. She tried not to imagine the speed of it all, the way countries fell like dominoes. She had watched the newsreels at the cinema, tanks rolling through Paris, German soldiers marching beneath banners that snapped in the wind. The world she'd grown up believing was solid suddenly felt fragile, as if history itself had cracked. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, rosary beads slipping through her fingers. They say England is next, she whispered. Anna swallowed. England won't fall, she said, though she didn't know why she believed it. Maybe because if England fell, there would be nothing between Eddie and the dark. Back at camp, the men trained like their lives depended on it, because somewhere deep down, they knew they would. They ran drills in mud and rain, learned to strip rifles blindfolded, practiced loading wounded onto stretchers while someone screamed in their ears. The screams were pretend, the fear was not. Sergeant Joe Ramirez barked orders with a voice like gravel. He'd fought before, in places most of the men had only heard of. He knew what rapid conquest looked like up close. "You think they move fast because they're lucky," he shouted as Eddie fumbled a magazine. "They move fast because they don't wait. They hit, they surround, they crush. That's what you're up against." Eddie nodded, hands shaking. He thought of the radio announcer, of France collapsing in weeks. He thought of how fast weeks could pass. At night, the men lay on their bunks and talked in low voices, about girlfriends back home, about baseball scores months old, about rumors, always rumors. "They say Germany and Russia carved up Europe like a steak," one man said. "They say Britain's hanging on by a thread," another answered. "They say if Britain goes, we're next." Silence followed that one. Captain Hale walked the barracks after lights out, listening. He heard fear, yes, but also something else, resolve, brittle but growing. These men knew the stakes now. Hitler's speed had changed everything. Old alliances had cracked. New ones were forming under pressure, forged by necessity rather than trust. A week later, the orders came. Not deployment, not yet, but preparation for coordination, joint exercises with British units. Planning sessions that stretched into the early morning, maps layered over maps, arrows erased and redrawn. "This isn't just about beating Germany," Hale told his officers. "It's about surviving long enough to stand together. Their speed is forcing our hand. We either adapt or we lose before we even arrive." Across the Atlantic, London burned at night. American observers watched from rooftops as bombs fell, the city flaring like a wounded animal. Among them was nurse Claire Whitman, volunteering with the Red Cross. She'd never seen so many broken bodies in one place, never smelled so much smoke and blood mixed together. "They don't stop," a British doctor told her, voice hoarse. "They come every night." Claire thought of home, of quiet streets and movie theaters and people arguing about whether the war was really America's problem. She wrapped another bandage, hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. "It will be," she said softly. "It already is." Back in England, Eddie stood on a cliff overlooking the grey sea weeks later, wind tearing at his coat. He hadn't expected to be here so soon. None of them had. The rapid collapse of Europe had pulled America forward like a current too strong to resist. He watched British fighters roar overhead, thin shapes against the clouds. Somewhere out there was the enemy, efficient, relentless, reshaping the world through speed and terror. Sergeant Ramirez joined him, lighting a cigarette. "You see that water?" he said. "That's the last wide thing between us and them. And it's getting narrower every day." Eddie nodded, throat tight. He felt small, standing at the edge of something vast and violent. But he also felt a spark, fear mixed with purpose. The war had changed, alliances shifting like tectonic plates under the weight of Hitler's advance. And now, whether America was ready or not, it was being pulled into the quake. As night fell, air raid sirens wailed in the distance. Eddie tightened his grip on his rifle. Somewhere in the dark, engines were starting. The storm was moving again. The first time Eddie Novak heard German artillery, he thought the sky itself was tearing open. It came low and distant at first, a rolling thunder that didn't belong to weather. The ground beneath the hedgerows of southern England trembled, birds exploding from trees as if fleeing a predator they couldn't see. Eddie pressed his helmet down harder, heart hammering, fingers slick around his rifle. "Stay sharp!" Sergeant Ramirez shouted. "This is a drill, but drills turn real damn fast." The word drill didn't comfort anyone. What had begun as coordination exercises became something else almost overnight. Hitler's rapid conquests had forced every nation still standing into motion. Germany's alliances had shifted like a knife through flesh. One pack signed here, another betrayed there. The Soviets were uneasy partners. Britain was bleeding but unbowed, and America, once distant, was now threading itself into the front lines of history. Captain Hale stood with British officers in a muddy command tent, maps spread across a table weighed down with ammo boxes. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. "They're probing," a British major said, tapping the French coastline with a pencil. "Fast raids, testing defenses, same pattern they used before Poland fell." Hale watched the pencil circle like a vulture. "They don't wait for perfection," he said. "They wait for weakness." That weakness came sooner than anyone expected. The night the convoy was hit, Eddie was on watch duty near the coast. The sea was black glass, broken only by the distant silhouettes of ships moving without lights. He'd just taken a sip of lukewarm coffee when the horizon erupted. Flashes tore through the darkness. A roar followed, deep, violent, unmistakable. German aircraft screamed overhead, dropping flares that turned night into a harsh white noon. "Air raid!" someone yelled. Eddie dove as machine gun fire stitched the earth. The smell of cordite burned his nose. Somewhere nearby, a ship exploded, the blast punching the air from his lungs even at a distance. He crawled through mud toward a trench, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Around him, men shouted orders, cursed, prayed. This wasn't training. This was the war finally reaching out and grabbing them by the throat. Sergeant Ramirez dragged a younger private down beside Eddie. "You alive?" he barked. Eddie nodded, teeth chattering. "Good," Ramirez said. "Then you're useful." By dawn, the raid was over. Smoke drifted across the water like ghosts refusing to leave. Wreckage bobbed in the surf. Splintered wood, oil slicks, a helmet with no head inside it. The casualty list was short, but the message was loud. Germany was fast, bold, and unafraid to strike anywhere. And every strike forced the Allies closer together, whether they trusted each other or not. In London, Nurse Claire Whitman worked for 36 hours without sleep. The wounded came in waves. British sailors pulled from burning ships, civilians caught by falling debris, an American pilot whose plane had limped back across the channel only to crash on landing. Claire cut away his flight jacket, hands moving by instinct. "Stay with me," she said, though she wasn't sure he could hear. He groaned, eyes fluttering. Did we stop them?" She met his gaze. "For tonight," she said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Back in the barracks, Eddie sat on his bunk, boots still caked with mud and blood that wasn't his. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He thought of his sister, of his mother's rosary beads, of how quickly the world had narrowed to the sound of engines and explosions. Lieutenant Carter sat beside him. "First time under fire?" he asked quietly. Eddie nodded. Carter let out a slow breath. "You did fine." "Didn't feel fine," Eddie said. "It never does." Word spread fast through the camp. Germany wasn't invincible, but it was relentless. Every rapid conquest had taught them speed was a weapon. And now, the Allies were learning the same lesson the hard way. Joint operations began almost immediately. American and British units trained together under real fire, learning each other's signals, their strengths and flaws. There were arguments over tactics, over command, over whose intel to trust. Captain Hale lost his temper during one planning session. "Your people keep assuming they'll slow down," he snapped. "They won't. They never have." A British colonel stared back, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion. "Then we adapt, or we die," he said. "Same as you." That night, Hale wrote a letter he never finished. He stared at the blank page, realizing how little there was to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. On a foggy morning, weeks later, Eddie's unit boarded transport trucks. The destination was classified, but everyone knew what it meant. The war was expanding. Lines were being drawn not just on maps, but in blood. As the trucks rumbled forward, Sergeant Ramirez stood, gripping the rail. "Listen up," he shouted over the engine noise. "Whatever you thought this war was going to be, forget it. The enemy moves fast. So do we. You stick together, you watch each other's backs, and you don't panic." Eddie swallowed hard, knuckles white around his rifle. He looked at the faces around him, men who'd been strangers months ago, now bound by fear and something like brotherhood. The convoy disappeared into the mist, engines growling like distant thunder. Somewhere ahead, the next test waited, and Germany, undefeated and accelerating, was already moving toward it. The first boots hit French soil before dawn, slipping in wet sand stained dark with oil and blood that hadn't yet dried. Eddie Novak stumbled forward under the weight of his pack as waves slapped the landing craft behind him. The sky was a dull, uncaring gray, smoke drifting low like a ceiling pressing down on the world. Somewhere inland, artillery boomed. Closer now, sharper. The war had finally stopped circling them. It was inside the wire. "Move! Move!" Sergeant Ramirez roared, shoving a man forward as bullets snapped overhead, biting into steel obstacles with a sound like angry insects. Eddie ran, lungs burning, boots sucking at the sand. A body lay face down near the surf, helmet rolled away, eyes staring at nothing. Eddie didn't stop. He couldn't. They reached a shallow embankment and threw themselves down. The beach behind them was chaos. Men yelling, medics dragging the wounded, smoke swallowing everything. German machine guns hammered from hidden positions, methodical and merciless. This was the speed everyone had warned about. Not just fast movement, but fast killing. "Orders!" Lieutenant Carter shouted, breathless. Captain Hale crouched nearby, radio pressed to his ear, jaw clenched. Static crackled, then a voice broke through, strained and urgent. "Enemy armor pushing south, faster than expected." Hale closed his eyes for half a second. That was it. The moment every briefing had circled without naming. Germany wasn't waiting. It never waited. While the Allies struggled to land and organize, the counterstroke was already coming. "Ramirez," Hale said, voice steady despite the noise. "Get your men moving inland. We don't stop them here. They'll roll right through the supply lines." Ramirez nodded once. "You heard him," he shouted. "Up and over." Eddie followed, legs screaming as they pushed through hedgerows thick with thorns and fear. The land beyond the beach was deceptively calm. Green fields, stone walls, farmhouses shattered by shellfire. It felt wrong, fighting in a place that looked like it should know peace. The first tank appeared through the smoke like a steel beast, treads chewing earth, gun swiveling with cold intent. "Panzer!" someone screamed. They scattered as the cannon fired, the blast throwing Eddie into the dirt. His ears rang, vision swimming. He tasted blood. Sergeant Ramirez grabbed him by the collar. "Eyes on me," he yelled. "You good?" Eddie nodded, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely reload. They fired everything they had, rifles, grenades, desperate hope. But the tank kept coming. German infantry followed close behind, moving with terrifying coordination. This was the doctrine that had swallowed Europe. Speed, shock, overwhelm. Captain Hale sprinted forward, signaling with his arm. "Fall back to the tree line! Draw them in!" Men hesitated, fear clawing at discipline, but they moved. Eddie ran again, heart in his throat. The tree line exploded around them as shells hit, branches raining down like splinters of bone. Then came the sound Eddie would never forget, a deep whine cutting through the chaos. Allied aircraft screamed overhead, diving low. Bombs fell, earth erupting in fire and smoke. The tank vanished in a thunderous blast, the shockwave knocking men flat. For a moment, just a moment, the advance stopped. Cheers rose, wild and broken. Eddie laughed, a hysterical sound, relief flooding him so hard his knees nearly buckled. But the radio crackled again. Enemy reinforcements approaching from the east, heavy. Hale stared at the horizon, smoke curling around him. He understood now. This wasn't one battle. It was a test of will, whose alliances would hold, whose men would break first. In a makeshift field hospital miles away, Nurse Claire Whitman worked with blood up to her elbows. The wounded poured in faster than they could be treated. American accents mixed with British cries, pain sounding the same in every language. A young soldier grabbed her wrist, eyes wide. "Did we stop them?" he asked. Same question she'd heard before. Claire swallowed. "We're holding," she said. It was half true. Back at the front, the line bent, but didn't break. Men fought until their rifles overheated, until their voices went hoarse from shouting warnings and names. Sergeant Ramirez took a bullet to the shoulder and kept firing, teeth clenched, refusing evacuation. "Not yet," he growled when a medic reached for him. "They ain't through with us." As night fell, the battlefield glowed with fire and tracer rounds. Eddie crouched beside Carter in a crater, rain mixing with dirt on their faces. "I didn't think I'd be this scared," Eddie admitted, voice barely audible. Carter let out a tired laugh. If you weren't, I'd worry. They shared a look, two men bound by terror and trust. Around them, the world seemed to burn. At dawn, the German advance finally slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The cost was staggering. Bodies lay in the fields, allied and enemy alike, history written in blood and mud. Captain Hale stood among his exhausted men, eyes hollow but unbroken. Germany's speed had changed the war, forced nations into desperate unity. And here, in this shattered stretch of land, that unity had been tested under fire. They had held. Barely. As medics moved through the aftermath and the guns fell silent, Eddie sat down hard, staring at his trembling hands. He was alive. For now. And the war, this fast, unforgiving war, was far from over. The radio crackled again, carrying new orders, new fronts, new demands. Eddie closed his eyes, bracing himself. Morning came quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned and dangerous all at once. Eddie Novak woke curled in a shallow foxhole, rainwater pooled at the edges, his body stiff with cold and exhaustion. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the smell hit him, burned metal, wet earth, blood, and memory snapped back like a trap. The guns were silent now, not because the war was over, but because both sides were breathing. He sat up slowly. Around him, men stirred like survivors of a shipwreck, faces grey with fatigue, eyes scanning instinctively for threats that weren't there anymore. Smoke drifted lazily across the fields, rising from wrecked armor and shattered farmhouses. Crows had already begun to circle. Sergeant Ramirez lay propped against a tree, his shoulder wrapped in a fresh bandage darkened with blood. He grinned crookedly when he saw Eddie. "Hell of a night, huh?" he said. Eddie nodded. "You're still here." Ramirez shrugged carefully. "Takes more than that." Lieutenant Carter walked past, limping slightly, calling out names, checking off the living. Each response, "Here, sir," felt like a small miracle. Each silence felt like a punch to the gut. Captain Hale stood apart, helmet off, hair matted with sweat and rain. He looked older now, as if the night had carved years into his face. He stared out across the field where the German advance had finally stalled, where speed had met resistance for the first time in days. They hadn't won, but they hadn't been erased. And in this war, that mattered. Hours later, the wounded were evacuated, the dead covered with ponchos and prayers. Eddie helped carry a stretcher, boots slipping in mud, muscles screaming. He didn't know the man on it, only that he'd shared a cigarette with him 2 days earlier. That felt like knowing enough. At the field hospital, Nurse Claire Whitman finally sat down. She hadn't realized how badly her hands were shaking until she tried to pour water and spilled half of it. A British nurse offered her a cigarette. Claire took it, even though she didn't usually smoke. "We held," Claire said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The other nurse nodded. "Because you were there. All of you." Claire thought of the American pilot she'd lost the night before, of the young soldier who'd asked her the same question everyone asked. Did we stop them? She knew now the answer was never simple, but she also knew this. Hitler's speed had forced the world to choose, to stand alone and fall quickly, or to stand together and bleed slowly. Weeks passed, the front shifted, hardened, supply lines stabilized. Allied command grew sharper, faster, learning from every near collapse. The Germans still moved with terrifying efficiency, but now they met resistance that anticipated their pace instead of chasing it. Eddie wrote home for the first time since the landing. "Dear Anna, I'm okay. I don't know how long that'll stay true, but it's true today. I've seen things I can't explain yet. Maybe I never will. But I know why we're here now. We didn't come because we wanted to. We came because if we didn't, there wouldn't be anywhere left to stand. He folded the letter carefully, hands steadier than before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky red like an old wound, Eddie sat with Sergeant Ramirez and Lieutenant Carter on an overturned crate. Someone had found a harmonica. The tune was rough, off-key, but familiar, home, in sound, if not in distance. "You think we're making a difference?" Eddie asked. Ramirez exhaled smoke slowly. "I think they thought we wouldn't get here in time," he said. And they were wrong. Captain Hale joined them, looking out over the encampment, American and British flags snapping side by side in the breeze. "They moved fast," he said. "Too fast for the old world to keep up. That's what broke everything. Alliances, borders, beliefs." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But speed cuts both ways. It woke us up." The men sat with that, listening to the distant rumble of guns far away. Other battles, other sacrifices. Eddie realized something then. The fear was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer owned him. Brotherhood did. Purpose did. Far across the ocean, in Brooklyn, Anna Novak read Eddie's letter twice, then a third time. Her mother pressed the rosary to her lips, eyes wet but hopeful. "They're standing together," Anna said softly. "That's how they'll win." Back in Europe, under a sky finally clear of bombers, for one fragile night, Eddie lay back and stared at the stars. The war was far from over. The cost would grow heavier before it ended. But Hitler's rapid conquests had failed to do one thing. They hadn't broken the human will to resist. And, in that quiet moment between battles, Eddie Novak allowed himself to believe, just a little, that someday this story would end.